If you want to mobilize people, you often invoke religious justification for our war. The great jihad is one's inner struggle to still my, and correct me if I'm wrong, to still my ego in and to follow. There are two types of people. They're law-abiding citizens for whom we should have guns available because it's a Second Amendment constitutional right that you or I, as law-abiding citizens, we should have the right. And people need, every other country controls the accessibility, the access to weapons.
In terms of overall temperature rising and things of that sort, I'm very divided. Dr. French, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So we've seen the evolution of war from, sticks and stones all the way to unmanned drones. What is the evolution of war theory accordingly?
Different religious traditions and cultures have developed different understandings, but some features remain kind of constant. An aggressor attacks some community, some tribe, some nation, and people defend, and people get killed, and property gets destroyed. So that doesn't change. What changes is, and I often say during warfare, the truth is the first casualty. So surrounding human conflict and warfare are lies, that they're a threat, that justifies us and our aggression against them. So you have attackers and defenders. In early war, you're using spears, swords, whatever, throwing rocks. But you have, once you get the Industrial Revolution, you get a massive escalation of weaponry, weapons advances. And so as I tell my classes, think of the 20th century, that World War I, 1914 to 1919, the effective range of reaching out and killing people was about 9 miles. The Germans had howitzers. That was effective range. They could hit pretty close to where they're targeting. And that was a real shock. The Germans in World War I also had a souped-up naval cannon. It could shoot a projectile 81 miles, but it wasn't very effective. They called it the Paris cannon because you needed a really big target to even justify shooting it. And so they shot that for something like 150 days or so. Didn't hit much of anything, but the effective range was about 9 miles. And so that means World War I, say the Western Front, which was a very static front, made static by the dominance of the machine gun. When both sides had machine guns, it simply meant it was a slaughter if you tried a frontal assault. So the end result was trench warfare. Protect your troops by digging trenches. And when both sides had machine guns, the front was pretty static. It wasn't going anywhere. So theoretically, if you put your howitzers up pretty close to your trench lines, they could shoot 9 miles one way. And if the other side put their howitzers up close to their trenches, they could shoot 9 miles in. So you had a killing zone, roughly 400 miles long and about 18 miles wide. One of the impacts was, because the front wasn't going quickly anywhere, villagers who were unfortunate enough to live near the front, they had enough time to pack up a wagon and skedaddle to get out. So on the Western Front, you had immensely high military casualties as both sides built railroads to bring troops up, but relatively low civilian casualties because there was a tight killing zone of 18 miles.
So we talked about Industrial Revolution and the evolution of that type of warfare. So obviously, as time goes on, we're going to keep innovating that type of technology.
Keep innovating. So we get the first airplane, the heavier than aircraft, said to be the Wright brothers, right? And the first airplane flight was about 180 feet. at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They used the Atlantic winds, and that gave them some lift. But within 11 years, that new innovation had been weaponized. So war put such pressure on nations and leaders. Use whatever you can, whatever power innovation you've developed, see if you can weaponize it. And so by 1911, the British, the Germans, the French, the Russians had biplanes. Their wings were wooden with canvas stretched across. They were pretty light. They couldn't carry a big bomb load. They did retrofit them with machine guns. And so you had aerial combat. They were mostly used for observation of enemy troop movements or to shoot down the enemy's observation planes. They did try to turn them into little bombers, but they couldn't carry a very heavy payload. But then think of the jump to World War II. By then you had the maturity of a number of technologies, like tanks were developed in World War I. They came in pretty late in the war, so it wasn't a significant factor in the Allies' victory over Germany and Austria-Hungary. But tanks solved the problem of the offensive capability of the machine gun. The tanks would allow, and the whole idea was, well, what can cause the bullets to bounce off? So they almost retrofitted the knight in shining armor model. So we need a vehicle that can go across the mud of no man's land. So it can't be tires. We have to be tracks because it's really rough ground. Yeah. Retrofitted with a machine gun and then later a cannon. And so the tanks were introduced by Great Britain, proved very effective. And in modern war, you see, it's like economic competition. You innovate, and if you see your opponents with a new innovation and you file it away and think, that's brilliant, we're going to copy it. So very quickly, all sides began to develop tanks in the last year or two of World War I. Other innovations, submarine warfare. During the American Civil War, we innovated from wooden-hulled ships to ironclad ships. And so you have developments in naval warfare, but especially in the air power. So by World War II, you get heavy metal bomber airplanes with an effective range of 600 to 800 miles out. And so now, during World War I, the generals were under a lot of pressure by the civilian leaders. Can you win this war? Can you break the enemy? They had every incentive and desire, if they could, to destroy the enemy's factory base back behind enemy lines. They just didn't have the capability. World War II, the airplane developments give them now the capability. And so you see much more bombing of cities happening in World War II. Germans bombing London, the British, they bombed by night. The Americans tend to bomb by day. I might have that mixed up.
Any reason for that?
Different customs, different leadership. Yeah, but say on one of the most horrific bombing cases in Western Europe was Hamburg, where Hamburg, Germany. The British came in at night, dumped huge loads of bombs on Hamburg. The Americans came in the next day at Hamburg, and then the British returned the following night. And it might have been the first or second night where they used incendiary bombs that are basically kind of jellied gasoline. So the bomb hits, it splatters, and then there's an ignition, and it's to burn buildings. Mm-hmm. And as British airplanes were leaving, they looked back and they saw this orange red in the clouds, something, and they realized, my gosh, it was the first firestorm that unwittingly was created, but the nations filed it away. And Hamburg was bombed for about 4 straight days and nights. Devastating bombing. But then the British and the Americans decided, well, this is kind of interesting. So we can use incendiary bombs. Let's see if we can intentionally cause a firestorm. So they dropped them on Dresden. And we're talking really late in the war. I think Dresden is like February of 1945. Everybody pretty much knew the war was over by then. And Dresden had no military significance. And they wanted to test out this new technology, this new capability that bomb innovations and airplane innovations had allowed them. Everybody talks about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, that's we end the war against Japan with the nuclear bombs. What people tend to forget, so the drama of that bombing is etched in the people's of the world's understanding. What's forgotten is that the Americans used incendiary bombs on Tokyo a month or two before, and I think more people died in that. That's considered conventional, right? You can still die from conventional bombing, but we were in a practice now of not batting an eye about bombing civilian centers. And we used incendiary bombs on Tokyo, and more people died in that bombing than died at Hiroshima or at Nagasaki.
So there's one thing you mentioned that I do want to touch upon, the idea that even without the firmware or the industrialization of it, the ideas are still the same. So, right, there's an offensive side, a defensive side. Is that always going to be the same? The ideas and concepts behind a war that started? Because I feel like that's just human nature.
And human nature hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot, has it? That peoples tend to be self-interested. And that means self-interested, and we have a bias toward our group. Before the nation state, it might have been tribal groups, or it might have been our people. Or in the medieval period, you had a lord-vassal relationship, so it might have been a principality or a ducal. In northern India, in Rajasthan, they went through a similar medieval period. We have castles for defensive purposes in Europe. Jerusalem still has walls around it that Saladin built for defensive purposes. We have walled cities in Europe, in Sevilla, in Avila, and Segovia. You have a wonderful fort at Segovia. And in northern India, you've seen the same phenomenon of city-states. It went through a city-state period. In Italy, Florence fought wars against Siena right up the road, and they built fortifications against their enemy friend, that city-state right up the road. So, and you had the same structure in Rajasthan, Kittajur, I can't pronounce it, Jaipur, Jaisalmer, and the castles and fortifications are still there. So, I'm impressed with a movie that gets into the psychology of aggression. We can see it in our current campaign. Our opponent is the enemy. We're good. We're good Americans.
In every story.
They're communists. They're the enemy. So that enemy-making dynamic hasn't changed a whole lot. In ancient times, even in the biblical sources, you can see the book of Joshua in the Bible. Moses has just died, and the the Israelites say they're given the promised land by God. And so the Israelite army comes in against the Canaanites. And, it's holy war. We had holy war in ancient times. We still have holy
The
war in
idea
our
of
time.
us versus
Us
you.
versus them.
Yeah.
And one thing, for propaganda purposes, or if you want to mobilize people, you often invoke religious justification for our war. Even in modern secular times, when the United States is not we don't have an official religion. Sociologists have noted nations still have a kind of civil religion. Even if you part God over here, when we go into war against Germany, we're saying they're barbarians. We're fighting a war for civilization. But now it's civilization with a capital C. And so we do a similar number of enemy making, even if we don't reach to saying, like in true holy war or true crusader war, as we saw the Christian crusaders trying to wrest the Holy Land back from what the Pope called the unclean nation, the Turks, Muslims. It's always easier to make war and to engage in the enemy-making process if people have different skin color or a different religion. Then you can kind of quickly, well, they're foreigners, they're not like us. So there's a kind of an emotional distancing. But you saw it in ancient times, and you saw it in medieval times, and we see it in contemporary times.
Right. Jerusalem's a perfect example.
Jerusalem's a great example.
Yeah.
And Al-Qaeda, the hijacking of the Muslim category of jihad, that the great jihad is one's inner struggle to still and correct me if I'm wrong, to still my ego and to follow Allah's teachings. The secondary jihad is the defense of a Muslim community. But that too can be perverted, just the way Pope Urban II perverted the teachings of Jesus
Yeah, the Crusades.
to call for the Crusades. The Crusades were partly in response to the Byzantine Empire, Christian, arguing, calling for aid against the Muslim Turks who are making inroads in what's now modern-day Turkey. So, I would say not a lot typically changes with human nature, and that means that ethical voices, ancient religious voices, or ancient philosophical voices can be a real source of ongoing wisdom because they were developing ethical understandings for the same sorts of problems of hatred.
Yeah.
And so the technology has changed, that you and I have to worry about mass shooters in the United States coming into our classrooms at Loyola University, or our classrooms of our younger brothers and sisters at high school or elementary school. Well, that's only because the United States is almost unique in lacking the political will to ban assault weapons. Big clip, 20 or 30 bullet clips. Almost all other nations have the wisdom to have tighter gun controls. And that whole debate is highly politicized. But usually the arguments run, well, if you're against, it's a slippery slope argument that is played out. Well, if you're going to take our assault weapons away, then you're going to take our deer hunting rifles and our single shot handguns away, right? Or our shotguns that we use for duck hunting. Or if you're going to take assault weapons away, then what? You're going to ban target practice. And that's called a slippery slope, that any bit of legislation for one weapon type is a threat to all those weapon types, and it's a threat to rural American family values, um, where hunting was part of the fabric of culture and still is in many areas. And even ecologists argue that we would have a surfeit of deer population. We'd have an overpopulation of deer in Wisconsin, and that's not good for the forests. And so environmentalists often argue, yeah, part of wildlife management is allowing a hunting season. So I'm not of the camp that argue hunters are evil and bad. Some are, but some
Poachers.
non-hunters are evil and bad too, right? We have to be qualified in our claims, in our judgments.
I feel like the gun debate is highly, highly controversial as well.
Absolutely, it is.
But on one hand, I will touch just a touch, so we can go back to it. But I feel like even if you ban, like you said, those high magazine capacity guns, anybody who wants to get a gun, really, they can, because of course there's illegal
Right.
gun owners, right? If you
Right.
truly wanted to, there's no shortage. There's only surplus.
Right.
So it's not about the qualifications or the licenses. It's about the mindset of the people.
Right.
How can you influence the people of the society to tell you that, oh, this is bad and this you shouldn't be doing this? What's the right way there? It's like a mass psychology type of activity, you know?
Well, I think gun manufacturers like to sell guns. So that's their economic self-interest. And the National Rifle Association likes to sell its magazine subscriptions and its memberships, and that's about $35 per year. So they've raised lots. So when you have, now they, at one point they claimed they had 4 million members. So you can do the math on terms of if all 4 million members are paying $35 a year, that's a lot of money flowing.
Yeah.
So then that suggests it doesn't take rocket science to figure out the leadership of the NRA has a they got a gold mine going. So they're not going to change their tune. After the Newtown, Connecticut shooting, that was the horrible one of a guy, his mom was a kind of an emotionally disturbed high schooler. His mom brought guns into the home to help her boys bond in target practice, and it would be a good family activity. So the guns were appropriately in a locked case. Well, the National Rifle Association likes to say there are two types of people. They're law-abiding citizens for whom we should have guns available because it's a Second Amendment constitutional right that you or I, as law-abiding citizens, we should have the right. And people need guns for maybe home protection or something. So the NRA tends to suggest that the real threat to families or to individuals is from that hostile stranger breaking in, shooting innocent people. Well, I don't know. The data on perpetrators, I think they found about 70% of the perpetrators of firearm homicides are friends or family or acquaintances.
Not a stranger.
Not the stranger
No.
danger. So, but the NRA suggests hypes the stranger danger so what's going to protect my wife or my family from stranger danger, a hostile break-in? Well, okay, I should buy a handgun and put it in the drawer. So the NRA suggests there's a solid wall between law-abiding citizens and criminals who are going to use guns for murder and mayhem. Well, just think through the recent mass shooting cases. Most recent comes to mind is a Georgia case. It was last week, I think. A 14-year-old kid with an assault weapon type murdered 4 people. Well, the day before, he was a law-abiding citizen. The day at. So it was a first time for everything. And for most of the mass shooters, the younger mass shooters, their mass shooting is their first criminal act. You see what I'm going at? That this purported solid notion that you have a stable class over here of law-abiding citizens, and then you have a stable class of criminals. If that were true, then you could allow access to buying guns to this group, and just build in policies to prevent the spread of guns to that group. But life is more complicated than that. And so in the Newtown, Connecticut shooting, his name was Adam Lanza. He woke up one morning, got the key to the gun cabinet, opened it. Now, he's a law-abiding citizen so far. Got the key to the gun cabinet, opened it, then he murdered his mother. So I'm not sure I would even call him a criminal. I mean, the act is murder, but he's a very emotionally messed up young person. But then after murdering his mother, he hops in the car with one or two assault weapons. I don't know all the details. Goes to Sandy Hook Elementary School. And that's where he murders about 20 first graders.
But what is it about this country specifically that we have so many of these cases? How is it that the 14-year-olds and the teenagers and the high schoolers only in America are taking their parents' guns and go out and commit atrocities? Like what's the mental state there? You know what I'm saying? Like, how is that different from other nations?
Early in our conversation, we said in some ways human nature doesn't change a whole lot across many generations. So my guess is that in Sweden and Switzerland and in France and in India and in Australia, well, you have roughly the same percentage of emotionally disturbed young people.
I'm sure, yeah.
It's just that they don't have access to the gun. So they might punch walls, they might hit somebody with a knife. It's very difficult to do a mass knifing, right? Just the weapon doesn't allow that. The weapon allows you to maybe
accessibility of guns in America.
It's the accessibility.
Make us different.
It's the accessibility. Every other country controls the accessibility, the access to weapons. Australia had, kind of like the United States, somewhat open access, but they went through one mass shooting. I don't know the details of that mass shooting, how massive it was. In this country, we define a mass shooting as anything 4 or above is a mass shooting.
Yeah,
the one in Australia so rocked the country that their government, the political parties got together, their government slammed down on gun sales. Now, what's ironic, so the United States has that Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Well, our Supreme Court has some justices that talk about the originalist position of that to interpret the Constitution, you must try to get into the mindset or the intentionality or the understanding of the people of the time. So I think the Bill of Rights was ratified 1789, I think. I could be off by a couple of years. So that suggests that an originalist understanding of the Bill of Rights, to bear arms, they meant not my arm, but they meant the weapons of the day. And so when you Google what were the weapons of the day in colonial America around 1789, it was really single-shot muskets, muzzle-loading single-shot muskets. And I think they even had some like handguns, but they were still single-shot. So,
What is the
okay.
evolution of weapons once again?
Well, yeah. Why are we suggesting that by arms, the founding fathers envisioned
An assault
bump
rifle.
stocks or assault weapons? That arms so if we do an originalist understanding, then okay, then the Second Amendment justified single shot weapons. Okay. Now it's all about where we draw the line on this development. The around the 1930s, we had such Al Capone organized crime in the United States, and hey, this is Chicago, right? They were using what called Tommy guns. I think it could shoot a lot on automatic, maybe semi-automatic, which is every finger pull, but it might have been even automatic firing. So they banned machine guns. So machine guns are still illegal. So the NRA doesn't seem to be arguing, almost nobody is arguing they should be legal too. So that's where we've drawn the national line at machine guns. Recently in Las Vegas, there was that outdoor concert, and a guy used a bump stock. I don't know all the mechanics, but I think it uses the recoil of the rifle to bump the trigger back onto the guy's finger. Functionally, it allows close to automatic fire. And a lot of people were murdered that day. And the Department of Justice said a bump stock mechanism, it's basically you can add it. It's a kit you can add to rifles to allow a much greater speed of firing where it approaches that of a machine gun. So the Department of Justice ruled that it was so close to the functionality of a machine gun, they banned it. They said it's illegal. Well, that has recently been overturned by your friend Clarence Thomas. He did the holding of the Supreme Court holding where he dug down into the legislation banning
Stock of it.
the machine guns, and he said no, actually, the bump stock can't be classed as a machine gun because the firing mechanism is different from the legislation. So it's now back legal, which is not a good public health thing. So back on our earlier point that do students in Italy sometimes get in fistfights on the playground, or do students in Italy sometimes go outrageous and throw a book at a teacher's head? Sure, people get angry. I would assume the anger rates are roughly parallel across cultures. What's the key variable that's the key and massive difference is the availability of high-powered weaponry.
Okay.
You can look at firearm homicide rates and see, well, I'm impressed by he was a social worker in New York. He wrote a book called Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun, where he had been a gang member. And he's a very important guy. I think his last name's Kennedy. And in his book, he's describing how in his day, a gang battle, an inner city gang battle, you'd show up with fists and sticks. And so you'd have your gang battle, but that's qualitatively different when you introduce guns into gang territory aggression. And the weaponry, it's qualitatively different when you allow. We banned assault weapons, so we banned the guns with the big clip sizes, the 20 and 30 round clips. it's not surprising those are the weapon of choice. If you're going to be a mass shooter and you want to commit mass carnage in a school, you're not going to go in
As
with a
many as
pistol.
possible. Yeah.
You're going to go in with high firepower.
You know, this does tell me something about each person's self-moral principles,
Yeah.
right? How strong are your morals and your ethical values that you would refrain from being held by emotional distress?
Yeah. That kid in Georgia, for the first time now, we're getting some cases where parents are being convicted of
Father,
negligence. And that's very important to up the road in Highland Park 3 summers ago. You had the 4th of July parade was shot up by a younger person. And you have these cases, and it gets back at that point that we think there's a stable community of law-abiding citizens, and then the criminals over here. Well, in many of these mass shootings, the gun is purchased legally by a parent. Adam Lanza's mom brought the guns, legal purchased, into the home. But the fact that you're the legal issues don't stop at the point of purchase. Gun control advocates use the language of bringing a gun into the home it has ongoing lethality. Like, I can buy the gun legally and I can put it in the drawer here, but I might not be in control of that drawer. You may have a bunch of friends over sometime, and a fight might break out over the Super Bowl, and usually there's alcohol involved with family disruptions and friendship disruptions. They get out of hand quickly. And so the purchaser of the gun might have been the father, the mother, the grandfather, the grandmother. It's all well and good so far. They bring the gun into the home. But unless they have 100% control for the next decades of that gun's lethality, the analogy is you're bringing a landmine into the home. Much like landmines are used during war, but the lethality of the landmine after the war's over, the American troops come back from Vietnam. The landmines are still there, and they can kill farmers 15, 20 years after the war is done and gone. So bringing guns into the home doesn't stop the legal concerns. You use the term kind of moral empathy too. I think most gun owners are into using guns for target practice or using guns to shoot ducks or go deer hunting. And I have no qualms with that. And they've been fed a line that gun rights are a package deal. So I would suggest that there's a middle position of, we're not trying to take your deer hunting rifle away, and we're not trying to attack duck hunters who enjoy hunting ducks. We may not personally think that's the sport for us, but you don't need assault weapons to say, I'm a target shooter and my sport of target shooting is going to be massively disrupted by banning assault rifles. You can still get single shot
Well, I mean,
guns.
assault rifles are usually listed under home defense.
A lot of them.
Yeah.
And for home defense. And that's what the medical community is good on. Home defense, and that's, the NRA wants to say that home defense might suggest to all Chicago parents, you need a home to defend you against an external hostile stranger threatening your children. But that depends upon that gun for the next 30 years being under lock and key. And then you got the problem of, if it's really under lock and key and it's not armed, if a break-in occurs, does that homeowner have the time to get the key and unlock it and load it to actually be used in home defense? So that means a lot of people, they bring the gun into the home and they are fearful of that stranger, and they say to themselves, maybe we need the guns to be kind of available if we need them, and we need the bullets to be kind of available too if we need it. But once you take that step, then you see we have the problem of, it's Super Bowl night and the dad who brought the gun into the home, or the mom who brought the gun into the home, they're out at another party. And now it's your 20 or 30-year-old kids or your high school kids, and a lot of alcohol, and a fist fight breaks out. And so in a stranger danger is real. I'm not denying that. But let's look at the gun data, the criminological data on something like 75% of the perpetrators of firearm homicides, firearm murders, are family and friends and acquaintances. Because that's where you socialize a lot.
Right.
And
Right.
our social engagements, mostly 90% are friendly. We have people over for a backyard barbecue. That's great. We're buddies. But anger can break out, even among friends and family.
Yeah.
Which is, there's a real irony here. There's a book by a woman scholar who are on the origins of the Second Amendment right to bear arms. She notes that it was first a British right, and that we Americans got it from the British common law tradition. Well, ironically, she argues the right didn't start out as a right. It started out as an obligation. In British village life, you didn't have a sheriff. You weren't paying a salary to men, typically, staying up all night. But it was kind of on a voluntary rotating basis. The menfolk of the village were assigned an obligation, 2 of them usually, to patrol the streets. And if they saw any mischief, a break-in or theft, they would set up a hue and cry. These are categories from British common law. And it was the obligation of like citizen policing. And in order to police well, that obligation then came over time to require that the 2 guys walking in the village, they should have a weapon. They should be ready to defend themselves or to defend against other perpetrators. And so it shifted to, slowly over time, probably a sword or some weapon, maybe a stick. But then that escalated up into they need to be armed. And so then we begin talking about gun rights, but the initial cause of it was a concern for the common good. Well, in Illinois, we don't have a right to open carry. Thank goodness. I think in Wisconsin they do have open carry. I was just talking to a student of mine who's from New Hampshire, and she said they have open carry capability. Texas famously has open carry laws. Is the common good of the community, of the public health of our young people, really promoted by open carry or not? And that's really kind of an empirical criminological question. Gun homicide rates are higher among most red states. Mr. Trump, for example, often denigrates San Francisco and Chicago and New York, as Milwaukee, as big cities run by Democratic mayors. So he often has stressed that these big cities, Chicago has, in absolute numbers, has in recent years sometimes led the country in terms of absolute numbers on an annual basis of firearm homicides. But we're a really big city. We have a lot of people. So it's not surprising that in absolute terms, our firearm homicides are greater than, say, New Orleans. But if you compare the number of people who live in Chicago with the number of people who live in New Orleans, you'll find that in Baltimore and New Orleans and a lot of the southern cities, their firearm homicide frequency is higher. While their absolute numbers are not, there's greater occurrence of it.
I do want to shift gears for 1 second.
Sure.
And it's very connected to this. But I asked you about moral ethics on this. How does religious ethics play into that? Is there ever a connection there?
Religious ethics is very important, I would say, because most people don't read Immanuel Kant or Aristotle in the West. And I can't speak intelligently about Confucian ethics or the history of Islamic ethics or Hindu ethics. So long before we had a kind of breakout of philosophical, highly rationalist ethicists in the 19th and 20th century, ethics has, at the popular level, more people practice and are informed by the religious ethics of their culture. I can speak a little bit about Western ethics as it drinks from primarily Jewish and Christian sources into Western Europe and into North America. So there's that. Western religious ethics often have the humility of listening to the sharpest philosophical ethicists of their day. So in the history of Christian theology, for example, you couldn't have some of the early Christian theologians without them listening to Platonic philosophy and the Stoic philosophy. It's the Stoics in classical Greece and in Roman thinking that give the notion of there's a natural law. I'm attracted to the Stoics because one understanding of them is that while the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, wrote books about governance, about the polis, about politics and the laws, they were talking about the governance of a city-state, Athens. Once Alexander took his armies across into Persia, you had a mixing of cultures between Greek and Macedonian and Persian cultures, and an intermarrying. And so then the question becomes, well, it's kind of easy to think about the common good of a city-state. One race, one religion, by and large, stratified into free and serfs, free and slave. But a multicultural empire needs to think about, is there any grounding for ethics that can capture the diversity? And so the Stoics began to think about and envision a cosmopolis. Polis is Greek for city-state. So they used that as a metaphor for thinking about a community of the cosmos, a community of all earth, a community of all the peoples of the earth. And they began to envision a universal grounding of ethics in natural reason, that we might be from different cultures and we might have different religions, but we all have the capacity of right reason. And so Christianity builds off of some of these drank deeply from those sources. So you could say it would be difficult to have an Augustine, one of the greatest early Christian theologians. He was also a Manichaean philosopher. He was a scholar of some of philosophical thinking. And then you can't have a Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, who was one of the foremost Christian philosophers and religious thinkers, without drinking heavily from the works of Aristotle. The West didn't have the Aristotelian texts. Those had been captured by Muslim armies who brought them back to Baghdad, where the Greek classics written in Greek were translated and embraced by Arabic scholars. And so some of the irony is Western Europe didn't have these Greek texts translated into Latin until in Cordoba and in Palermo, where you had tables of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars who were able to take those texts that had been translated into Arabic, and they were translating them out of the Arabic, the second language to which they had been translated out of the Arabic into Latin. So that caused a frenzy of Christian theological innovation that led to Thomas Aquinas. Not only did the Christian West get the Arabic contribution, the Muslim contribution of the Arabic translations of Aristotle, they got the Arabic translations into Latin of Arab Muslim theologians who had been arm wrestling with how do we Muslims incorporate the secular philosophy of Aristotle into our own monotheistic understanding with the Quran. So the Arab theologians had been working on that proposition for like 2 centuries, 3 centuries. And so Aquinas is given this great gift of the translation into Latin of Aristotle, but also the writings of Avicenna and Ibn Rushd, great Muslim scholars.
This massive plethora of information and philosophy.
Exactly.
You mentioned the Cosmopolis.
Yeah.
I feel like that'd be an end result, a beneficial result to, like we mentioned in the beginning, the me versus you.
Yes. Yes.
We're all of one.
And there was a guy, Paul Kennedy, who wrote a book preparing for the 21st century. And he argued the old notion of national or cultural identity and separation, and even national sovereignty. His take was, during the 20th century, the notion that American sovereignty or British sovereignty or Indian sovereignty across the 20th century, hey, it's a global economy. And whether we like it or not, it's just a fact. We live in a global economy. And guess what? In the late part of the 20th century, our scientists began to, and the community of scientists weren't just American or European. They were Chinese, they were Indian, they were Pakistani, they were Egyptian. Scientists were beginning to recognize human population surge. We quadrupled human population in the 20th century. We went from 1.6 billion people to roughly 6.2 billion people. Now we have roughly 8 billion people. So whether we like it or not, Paul Kennedy's point was, we're in it all together. And it's not necessarily universal kumbaya, we're all great friends, but we are trading partners. And what happens in the global economy and the the scientific and technological innovations that may happen in China are going to be copied in the United States and Europe, and vice versa. I mean, look at the way the internet has changed every culture, every economy. And the cosmopolis, so what that means is it's quite meaningful to say there is a global human community now, whether we like it or not. We share common ecological challenges. We all share the impacts of climate change and of habitat destruction and of species endangerment. So we now share greater human responsibility. At the beginning of 1900, we didn't have to worry about the Amazon. The Amazon or the elephant herds, they were solid. By the end of the 20th century, by 2000, if we're going to have the Amazon in 50, 100 years, it's going to be only if humanity steps up and protects the Amazon. And the default now is ongoing climate disruption. So we all have a universal general stake in mitigating continuing climate disruption.
So the entire world has become one big community.
Yeah.
And we know we have our own issues within the community, obviously.
We do. And we have nation states that privilege national interest above global interest. But the world's peoples are involved in a historic conversation. The United Nations, for over 20 years, has been pushing us to have annual climate summits. And at one of them a few years ago, at the Paris Climate Summit, they passed the first historic ever, almost universal, 192 countries signed on to that we commit to trying to take steps to mitigate mounting climate change. It was a weak treaty, but it was all we could get through at the time. We don't have a global government. The UN is not a global government. It's a thoughtful network of national leaders drawn from all the countries where they have a conversation about the common good of humanity, but they don't have accountability. They don't have big budgets. They don't have national budgets to hold nations accountable for not meeting our carbon caps.
Well, on the climate change issue, I'm not sure if we agree on that, but
Yeah.
I'm not going to disagree that there are companies that do ecological waste and they pollute the environment or whatever. But in terms of overall temperature rising and things of that sort, I'm very divided. I will say.
Well, it took them 20 years. The world is very divided on those.
Yeah.
In those conversations, it was first the island nations, the Maldive Islands and the Bahama Islands, and a few other island peoples began to use language of, we're climate victims. We have small populations.
Talking about water rising levels?
To water rising ocean levels, yeah. And who are the climate perpetrators? And so the language, because there is a huge some peoples, some small nations, have very little impact in the historic contribution to atmospheric carbon buildup. The chief climate perpetrators have been those nations that industrialized earliest.
First world countries.
That would be Great Britain, Germany second, United States third. We've been surging our economic growth by the burning of coal and oil since, 1775 or 1800. Right now, the top three annual climate emitters are first China, then the United States, then India. But China and India have only industrialized heavily in say, the last 50 years or so. So they have not been surging carbon and methane into the global atmosphere for very long, whereas the United States has been, and some of the European nations have been. So we would pick them out as climate, the latter ones we'd pick out as climate perpetrators. India and China stalled during those 20 years of negotiations. Their position was, yeah, we need those who have benefited from the burning of coal and oil, the rich nations like Canada, Australia, Japan, the United States, Great Britain, Germany. Those are true culprit nations that bear a significant responsibility for this global problem. But China and India didn't want to accept any carbon caps because they argued we have a large population and many of our population remain in poverty. So they wanted an easement to those caps. Finally, it was a deal cut with Obama and Xi Jinping of China that China would finally accept in 7 years or so carbon caps. Partly, I think, what pushed China's changed position was that Beijing and many other Chinese cities were experiencing a lot of air pollution due to the burning of coal-fired power plants and coal-fired factories. So there were both self-interested reasons, but then also globally interested reasons that caused China to shift. And India jumped on board. And it was that shift that allowed the Paris Climate Accords to go through.
Yeah, well, they saw a negative effect right there in their own country.
Did they? I don't know.
Yeah, if you go to northern India or China, you'll see the haziness in the atmosphere.
Oh.
Things of that sort.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to see the solution to this, and I feel like the solution isn't, cutting down on like gasoline, because like if you talk about the production of such things, like the production of an electric battery for an electric car is carbon-wise, it's much more than mining for oil. Like,
Right.
Yeah, if you've seen like a lithium mine, like they're massive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that whole shift is going to require increased mining of these precious earth metals. Yeah.
But then you can also shift it to things like factories in India and China, like they say.
Yeah.
So how do you draw a balance between, I need this because I have this big of a population,
right.
but this is harming the environment.
Yeah.
Where we cut it.
The justice arguments suggest that we should be attentive to those countries, the heaviest burdens. Climate change is burdening all peoples, right? And damaging all peoples. But rich nations should bear a distinctive burden. They got the money. China and India are special cases because they have such large populations.
Well, that's the equity argument, right?
Exactly. We have complex equity arguments, but that doesn't. That doesn't overthrow the prudential need for China and India. Their peoples will be hammered unless the global community is able to mitigate the amount of carbon emission going into the atmosphere. So, ever seen the movie? It's called Independence Day.
The aliens one? One?
Alien Invaders,
yeah.
right? And so
I haven't seen it, but I know what you're talking about.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's a Mideast saying. It means the United States joined with communist Russia to defeat Hitler, right? Not because we loved
we had
the Soviets, but it's prudence.
Yep.
The enemy of my enemy, I'll join in a temporary alliance to defeat the common threat. Well, I think of climate change as a kind of global, certainly it's a massive global threat. Summer temperatures in somewhere in the Mideast, correct me if I'm wrong, reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. I think
Well, Britain just had their coolest summer since like 1950 or something.
we're getting, that's
This
right.
year.
It's not this continuous
It's
climate
fluctuating, yeah.
change. It's episodic.
Well, that's why we
and
call it climate change and not global heating.
I tend to call it climate disruption because, like the United States, we're going to get differential droughts in some areas, and we're going to get differential flooding in other areas. One of the dynamics is warmer air temperatures hold 4 to 5% more water vapor than the atmosphere used to hold. And what that means is the whole hydrological cycle is more dynamic, where the clouds hold more water. We can get more torrential rain bombs, they've been called by an Italian mayor. So we get episodic torrential rains just causing more costs to property and lives in flooding. The hurricanes often in the United States follow a pattern coming in across the Gulf of Mexico where they pick up the heat energy from the warm waters. You get the slamming of the hurricanes into the Gulf Coast. And that's where all the TV cameras and all the high wind velocities are. So that's what gets covered. Once the hurricane winds go inland, the wind velocities drop down, and then we begin to forget about it. Until 3 or 4 days later, we get torrential rains in the Appalachians, and then we get torrential floods, and we get little villages wiped out. And a lot more people die in those floodings sometimes than we get at the hurricane face. So it's very complicated, the justice and the prudence arguments. But it means we have there's a common shared interest now between India and China and the United States.
Temporarily.
And
Yeah.
yeah. And so there's some hope in taking that.
Do you think they'll transfer over to peace generally afterwards? Like you said, just for the time being, for this issue, India, China, America work together. The issue resides, just like, America and Russia work together to take care of Hitler.
Yeah.
The issue resides. What goes on after that?
Well, it depends on the scientific voices being joined by the religious leadership and Hollywood and Bollywood leadership. You use whatever power you have,
Yeah.
right? Taylor Swift endorsed Kamala Harris. Who's Taylor Swift? I gather she's a very famous young singer, right? She has a massive following. So even Hollywood and Bollywood celebrities can lend their voice. It was telling and smart that the United Nations asked Leonardo DiCaprio, right, the Hollywood famous guy, to be the UN's ambassador for a year on climate change, because people will turn out to hear Leonardo DiCaprio. I should invite him to a Loyola, because if he's going to speak on climate change, if Bill French is going to speak on climate change, 5 people might show up. But if Leonardo DiCaprio is going to speak, you'll have 10,000 people showing up. So in our country right now, the media has not done a good job in covering the significance of climate change. So climate change is not even a big issue in our current election, and it should be.
Yeah. Harris has talked about it.
She has. Biden did a lot more to address and begin to commit funds to build more solar and wind power and shift out of gasoline cars to electric vehicles.
I don't support that.
It's not
I don't
enough.
like that.
I know you don't. You and I would need further conversations about it. But one would hope that as China and India grow their economies, they will see that it's in their own interests to go solar and wind power and geothermal power and wave power. That would be my hope, at least.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've seen the wave power, like the things that go up and down in the waves.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was pretty cool. I'll give you that.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah. One last question. What are your words of wisdom for the world?
Wow. Use the power we have to Google or seek out information sources that seem credible, and to be responsible in discerning what are information sources that are misinformation, that are disinformation, and to talk to a wide range of people and to speak respectfully to people. So, because we surely do have profound common interests as a global community. And to pick you can't deal, we're little individuals. So pick an area where you think you can take an active role in being a bit of a leader in that area.
Thank you for watching. If you liked that video, please be sure to hit the subscribe button for more.